The most dangerous secrets are not the ones we keep from others, but the ones we keep from ourselves. In the heart of Georgia, nestled deep within the deceptive green of the Antebellum South, stood a place called Oak Grove. It wasn't a grand, white-columned estate, but a modest, unnervingly efficient plantation that hid a truth so vile, so surgically precise, that it defied the very limits of human cruelty. The year was 1852. The owner was a woman named Eleanor Alcott, a widow, a planter, and a mother with a singular, terrifying obsession: the preservation of her family name. The Alcotts had been a foundational family in the state, their lineage stretching back to the earliest colonial grants, their pride measured in their long, unbroken chain of male heirs. But fate, with its cold, ironic humor, had played a cruel joke. Eleanor had been blessed with three daughters, Clara, Beatrice, and Lydia. Beautiful, proper, and useless to her grand design. Because a Southern dynasty, she believed, could not be carried forward by daughters, it needed a son. A son to bear the name, to inherit the land, to maintain the status. But Eleanor Alcott was not a woman to be defeated by biology or tradition. When she realized the Alcott bloodline was destined to fade, she didn't mourn. She calculated. She didn't pray. She planned. What she needed was not a son of her body, but a son of her design. A son bred with the strength and vigor she saw only in the men she was legally entitled to own, the men who worked her fields. And so, the plantation ledger, the very symbol of Southern commerce, became a cryptic, chilling family register. The truth, when it was finally whispered years later, was a horror. The matriarch, consumed by the legacy of her name, had chosen to breed her daughters with enslaved men, selected meticulously, almost scientifically, to create the perfect heir. This is the forbidden history of Eleanor Alcott, and the chilling lengths she went to ensure her name would never die. If you're listening from the South, or anywhere this dark history has left its mark, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're from. And if the chills have already started, make sure you hit that subscribe button to join the few who dare to uncover the macabre mysteries of America. Oak Grove was the color of Georgia clay, red, unforgiving, and deeply rooted. When Eleanor Alcott inherited the property in 1848 after the sudden death of her husband Thomas, the local gentry expected her to fail. Plantation management was a man's domain, a brutal calculus of weather, crops, and human property. Eleanor, then barely 40, with eyes the color of iced tea and a posture as rigid as a fence post, confounded them all. She dismissed the overseer, reviewed the accounts herself, and within 2 years had doubled the plantation's cotton yield. She was relentlessly efficient, utterly unsentimental, and possessed an unnerving ability to read market trends that surpassed every man in the county. She became known as the Lady of Oak Grove, a title of cold respect, never affection. Her neighbors observed her actions, but they failed to observe her motivation. They saw a shrewd businesswoman. They missed the calculating, wounded matriarch burning with a dynastic fever. The real estate was a means to an end. The cotton was merely a distraction. Eleanor was building something far more valuable and dangerous than a cash crop. She was building a gene pool. This was the deep, secret wound that drove her. Thomas, her husband, had provided her with 3 daughters but no son. A fact she viewed not as a personal tragedy, but as a deliberate insult from the universe. And in her private study beneath the floorboards lay the evidence of her horrifying strategy, a second, hidden ledger bound in black leather. It contained no financial figures. Instead, it was filled with meticulous, handwritten notes, observations on the physique, intellect, and ancestry of every enslaved man who passed through Oak Grove. She documented the shape of hands, the set of eyes, the presence of rare birthmarks. She was charting a horrifying, inverted family tree. The very first entry in that chilling register wasn't a record of a slave purchased or a bale of cotton sold. It was a detailed, clinical analysis of her eldest daughter, Clara, and a frightening projection of the traits she would need to erase or amplify. The Alcott daughters were a vision of Southern propriety. Clara, the eldest, was 22, poised and outwardly compliant, but she possessed a hidden intellect that both mirrored and challenged her mother's. Beatrice, the middle sister, was known for her artistic temperament, a fragile spirit that seemed to be slowly collapsing under the weight of the plantation's silence. And Lydia, the youngest, was a study in profound, quiet terror, retreating into a world where she hoped her mother's shadow couldn't reach. To the outside world, their lives were perfect: needlepoint, piano lessons, and an endless parade of eligible young men who came calling. But inside Oak Grove, the air was thick with unspoken fear. Their mother, Eleanor, had ceased to train them in the expected arts of Southern womanhood. Instead, their lessons took a dark, unexpected turn. Eleanor would gather them in the study, not to discuss poetry, but to pore over genealogical charts of the county's founding families. She taught them to identify traits: the distinctive Pembleton jaw, the rare red hair of the Caldwells, the unusual height of the McQueens. She taught them to see humanity not as souls, but as a terrifying collection of genetic data points. "A name is only as strong as the blood that bears it," Eleanor would say, her voice devoid of warmth, her finger tracing lines of descent on the paper. The daughters quickly understood the subtext. The Alcott blood was weakening, and it was their duty to fix it. This was their education, the study of human livestock. The horror deepened when Eleanor began to apply these lessons to the men who worked the fields. One evening, after a particularly chilling session on the inheritance of eye color, she pointed to a young field hand crossing the yard. "Observe his carriage, Clara," she commanded. "Note the width of his shoulders, the set of his chin. He carries the strength of a line unbroken by self-pity or weakness." The daughters understood then that their duty was not just to observe, but to contribute. They were being trained as midwives and witnesses to their own unimaginable violation. They were slowly realizing their mother was grooming them, not for marriage, but for a calculated, necessary defilement. The Alcott name was Eleanor's true religion. Her obsession wasn't simply about power or land. It was about a feverish, almost religious belief in aristocratic permanence. In her mind, the extinction of the Alcott name was a kind of historical crime, an affront to the very structure of the society that had elevated her family. It was a paradox so chilling it could only exist in the warped logic of the time. To preserve the pure white dynastic name, she had to strategically and systematically incorporate the most forbidden of all bloodlines. She saw it as an act of terrible necessity, a means of securing the future by committing a crime against the present. Her method was simple: the purchase of young, strong male slaves. But unlike other planters who bought for endurance and brute force, Eleanor purchased for bloodlines. She traveled to distant markets, disguised as an ordinary buyer, her eyes not on the price, but on the potential for genetic contribution. She developed a reputation for paying exorbitant prices for men who possessed certain lookings: a distinctive brow, a powerful build, a particular shade of skin that spoke of robust health and deep ancestry. And her search finally culminated in the purchase of a man named Elias. Elias was a carpenter by trade, 25, powerful, and possessing an astonishing rare feature: a distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark behind his left ear. Eleanor had spent years tracking that specific mark through archives, tracing it to a family in South Carolina, a family whose wealth and status had been built on a deep, dark secret of illicit bloodlines. Elias was, genetically, the perfected candidate for the first stage of her plan: the creation of an ideal template. She brought him back to Oak Grove, housed him in a small, isolated cabin, and gave him better rations than the other field hands. The other enslaved people at Oak Grove, wise to the silent cruelty of their mistress, avoided Elias. They knew he had been chosen not for labor, but for a darker, more intimate purpose. The tension in the air was palpable, a quiet, growing hum of dread. Eleanor's plan was about to shift from theory to horrifying practice. The night Elias was brought into the main house, under the cloak of a manufactured illness, marked the true beginning of the Alcott family's dark new chapter. Eleanor gathered her 3 daughters, clad in their nightgowns, and led them through the dark house to the hidden, soundproof room, ostensibly to learn how to administer a night draft, but in reality, to witness the first ritual of the blood transfer. Oak Grove was designed by Eleanor Alcott's late husband, Thomas, and it had a single, unsettling feature that set it apart from its neighbors. A small, windowless, strangely soundproof room built into the back wing, accessible only through a utility corridor off the main pantry. The room had been added in the final years of Thomas's life, ostensibly as a secure space for storing silver and important documents. In reality, it was a tomb of silence, lined with heavy cypress wood and insulated with packed clay, designed to ensure that what happened inside remained completely unheard by the servants' quarters or the passing neighbors. To the enslaved people of Oak Grove, this room, which they simply called the Quiet Room, was the locus of their deepest, unspoken fears. They knew things went in there, and that those things never came out the same. They knew its door was always bolted from the inside. That night, Eleanor led her daughters and Elias to that door. She carried a single oil lamp, its light casting monstrous shadows on the cypress walls. The air inside was still and heavy, smelling faintly of disinfectants and old earth. Eleanor's instructions to her daughters were clinical, delivered in a low, steady voice that stripped the act of any humanity or emotion. She commanded Clara to hold the lamp steady, Beatrice to prepare the documentation materials, a large sheet of parchment and a charcoal pencil, and Lydia to stand watch at the corridor door, though no one ever walked that hall after dark. The terror was not in what was about to happen, but in the chilling, organized neutrality with which Eleanor orchestrated it. She was conducting a terrifying, private biological experiment, and her own children were her reluctant, terrified assistants. She spoke to Elias not as a man, but as a vessel, reciting the Alcott family history and the need for the bloodline's continuation, framing his violation as a strange, inverted form of historical necessity. Elias, paralyzed by the narcotic she had administered and the sheer psychological pressure of the moment, could only watch the lantern light reflect in the cold glass of Clara's eyes. He was the subject, they were the tools. And as the heavy bolt of the quiet room slid shut, sealing the four of them inside, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic ticking of the parlor clock, measuring out a night that would fundamentally rewrite the Alcott family tree. The hours in the quiet room were a blur of meticulous clinical horror. Eleanor Alcott was neither a woman driven by lust nor sadism, but by a terrifying, cold logic. She treated the entire event like a scientific recording session. She was obsessed with documenting every potential genetic indicator. As the process unfolded, she directed Beatrice to sketch the shape of Elias' skull and the set of his jawline, features she had traced in the Alcott ancestors. She had Clara measure the circumference of his wrist and the length of his tibia. The act itself was swift, terrifying, and utterly devoid of passion, a transactional event undertaken solely for the purpose of genetic transfer. The true violation for the daughters was not the presence of Elias, but the forced, detailed witnessing of their mother's soulless, pragmatic atrocity. They were forced to watch a woman violate all social, racial, and moral codes, yet do so while dressed in the starched white linen of a Southern lady. As the morning light began to gray the edges of the corridor door, the ceremony concluded. Eleanor did not speak of the future or the potential consequence. She only spoke of data. The final, crucial step was the examination of Elias' body. Eleanor was searching for the smoking gun, the definitive physical proof that her genetic hypothesis was correct. She checked the nape of his neck, the soles of his feet, and finally, precisely where her archive research suggested it should be, behind his left ear, the crescent-shaped birthmark. It was small, distinct, and undeniable, a near-perfect match to the familial marker of the South Carolina family she had been tracking. Her eyes, usually cold, flickered with a brief, terrifying triumph. "Proof," she whispered, her voice tight with satisfaction. The daughters stared at the mark, realizing that their mother had not chosen this man randomly. She had engineered this moment. Elias was a living, breathing testament to hidden Southern genealogy, and the Alcott daughters were now inextricably linked to this terrifying new bloodline. As Eleanor turned to leave the room, she looked back at Elias and with a chilling lack of concern stated her final decision. "He has served his purpose. Now he is evidence." The black leather ledger, now filled with the horrifying documentation from the quiet room, was Eleanor's true treasure. It was no mere accounting book. It was a biological archive, a testament to her unique, warped interpretation of eugenics. The entries were written in a meticulous, custom cipher, a secret code based on old mercantile shipping symbols she'd learned from her father, a code no plantation overseer or tax assessor would ever be able to decipher. The ledger contained the real, raw figures of Oak Grove's enterprise, not the pounds of cotton harvested, but the genetic potential harvested. Each page was dedicated to one man, listing not his sale price but his traits. The dagger mark for Elia's birthmark, the high brow a feature traced to another prominent family, the iron will her assessment of a man's psychological fortitude. This was the terrifying genius of Eleanor's system. The plantation's surface profitability was merely a smokescreen for the hidden main operation. The constant, profitable sale of young men suggested a thriving labor business. But the real profit, the hidden dividend, was the slow, methodical compilation of a gene pool tailored for her future heir. She wasn't building a cotton empire. She was assembling a human library. The public ledger showed modest success, enough to keep the neighbors impressed but not suspicious. The private ledger detailed a genocidal selection process. The ultimate destination for the chosen men was never a profitable sale. It was extinction, to ensure no living proof could ever challenge the paternity of the child she intended to create. The ledger itself was the evidence she would use to protect her son's claim, a document proving his superior, selective, and essential bloodline should any challenge ever arise. But as she was sealing the ledger back beneath the floorboards, Eleanor heard a faint, persistent scratching sound coming from the wall, a sound that suggested someone somewhere had been listening or perhaps was trying to communicate with the victims. 3 weeks after the horrific ceremony, Elias was prepared for his supposed transfer. Eleanor had arranged his sale to a distant planter in Alabama, a transaction handled through 2 separate intermediaries to obscure the paper trail. He was examined by the county doctor, certified as being in prime physical condition, and loaded onto a transport wagon late one evening. The financial records were perfect, the receipt was signed, the sale was undeniable, but Elias never reached Alabama. His buyer, a man named Prendergast, sent an irritated but not overly suspicious letter weeks later. The transport driver swears the man fled near the state line. Provide refund or replacement. Eleanor responded with cold professionalism, providing copies of the flawless paperwork and expressing a manufactured regret over the common issue of runaways. The matter was officially dropped. 5 other men followed Elias in the next 4 years, all carefully selected, documented, used, and then vanished on the road between Oak Grove and their supposed buyers. 5 clean transactions, 5 men officially noted as fled. The pattern should have been noticed, but the system of slavery was built on the premise of constant flight, and Eleanor's paperwork was impeccable. What no one knew, except for Eleanor and perhaps her frightened daughters, was that Elias and the others hadn't fled. They lay buried deep within the most remote, uncultivated section of Oak Grove, a rocky, unused patch of earth Eleanor had long insisted was reserved for a future vineyard. They were buried with the same meticulous care she applied to her ledgers, their bodies permanent, silent evidence of her monstrous ambition. But the constant cycle of purchases, uses, and disposals created a terrifying current of fear among the remaining Oak Grove slaves, a knowledge that the mistress was not merely harsh, but was an architect of disappearances. As the list of vanished men grew, Clara, watching the transport wagons leave, finally found the courage to look at her mother and ask the question that had been clawing at her sanity. "Where do they really go, Mother?" Eleanor merely smiled, a terrifying, humorless expression. At this point in the story, I have to ask you, the viewer, a chilling question. Do you think this was an isolated case, a unique act of madness, or something bigger, a secret horror hidden by the systemic silence of the time? Hit that like button if you're with us and share your theory in the comments. Clara Alcott, the eldest daughter, was slowly dying beneath the surface. Forced to be an accessory to her mother's genetic tyranny, she became a master of quiet surveillance. She watched Eleanor constantly, mapping her habits, her routines, and most importantly, the movement of the black leather ledger. Clara, however, was also driven by the ghost of her father, Thomas. She remembered him as a kind, gentle man, sickly in his final years, often closeted away with his own set of account books. She couldn't reconcile his memory with the monstrous operation her mother was running on his land. Clara began her own quiet investigation. She searched the study, not for the obvious ledger, but for something her father might have hidden. Her search led her to an old, unused tobacco tin secreted beneath a loose floorboard in the main bedroom, a place Eleanor rarely visited. Inside, she found a single, brittle, handwritten letter from Thomas, dated just 3 months before his sudden death. The letter was addressed to an attorney in Charleston and began with a frantic, desperate plea. "I fear my wife is not well. Her obsession with the family line has crossed a line of moral consequence. I must petition you to begin legal proceedings to annul the property transfer and protect the girls from her current endeavor." Thomas Alcott had known. He had suspected. He had tried to stop Eleanor and was actively seeking legal intervention when he died. The official cause of death was listed as apoplexy, a sudden stroke. But holding the brittle, yellowed paper in her hand, Clara felt a cold, terrifying certainty. Her father had died not of natural causes, but because he stood in the way of Eleanor's terrifying dynastic obsession. Her mother had not only used and disposed of enslaved men, she had cleared a path to her ambition by eliminating her own husband. The horror intensified, transforming Clara's fear into a cold, focused resolve. She was no longer just a victim, she was the guardian of her father's evidence. But as she slipped the letter into the lining of her skirt, she heard the firm, measured tread of her mother's footsteps approaching the bedroom. And she knew she had mere seconds before Eleanor discovered the secret tin was no longer empty. Eleanor's reaction to her husband's death, real or engineered, was to double down on her plan. She needed to know if the first ceremony with Elias had taken root, but she could not wait on nature. She needed a backup, and she needed to test the limits of her daughter's obedience. The second man she purchased, named Jeb, was radically different from Elias. Jeb was chosen not for a specific ancestral mark, but for his exceptional intellect and prodigious strength, traits Eleanor wanted to graft onto the Alcott line. His purchase price was astronomical, his profile matching the exact metrics she had recorded in her coded ledger under the entry "potential for dominance." The ceremony with Jeb was even more brutal than the first, precisely because Eleanor made it a direct psychological test for Clara. She did not allow Clara to stand in the shadow, she brought her directly into the light. "The record must be perfect, Clara," Eleanor commanded, her voice a whipcrack of expectation. "You must draw the markings, you must record the details, and you must understand that this is your duty, to the name, to the land, to the future you will bear." She forced Clara's hand, guiding the charcoal pencil across the parchment to document Jeb's physique. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. Clara's spirit fractured under the forced proximity to the crime and the complicity in its documentation. She was no longer just a silent witness. She was an active participant, her hand recording the very violation that would soon lead to her own. This was Eleanor's most effective form of control, shared guilt. As the sun rose and Jeb was returned to the fields, slated for disposal in a few weeks, Clara was left trembling in the quiet room, the charcoal dust staining her fingers like fresh blood. She looked at the parchment, a perfect, clinical drawing of Jeb's form, and the sight of her own accurate, artistic contribution made her physically ill. She had proven to her mother that she could follow orders, that she could document the horrors. But what Eleanor didn't see was the single, nearly imperceptible drop of water, a hidden, silent tear, that fell from Clara's eye and landed squarely on Jeb's recorded name, a tiny act of resistance that would be the only proof of the inner turmoil that would soon lead her to a final, desperate betrayal. Eleanor Alcott had to justify the monstrous acts to herself and, more importantly, to her daughters. She didn't use the language of Southern patriarchy. She used the language of dynastic survival. She gathered the girls again, not in the quiet room, but in the sunlit parlor, demanding they listen to her twisted doctrine of necessity. "Look at your cousins," she commanded, gesturing to a portrait of her extended, inbred family. Weak chins, pale constitutions, men who can't hold their liquor or their land. The Alcott name is pure, yes, but it is also fatting. We are surrounded by families who built their fortunes on the strength they deny in public, the vibrant blood of a forbidden race. Her voice was chillingly calm as she inverted the racist logic of the time. She wasn't degrading herself. She was elevating her line by strategic theft. She argued that the men she purchased possessed the physical and intellectual rigor that centuries of inbreeding among the white gentry had depleted. By incorporating this vigor, she was preserving the white Alcott name, ensuring its dominance would last another 2 centuries. "You are not committing sin," she hissed, looking directly at the horrified Beatrice. "You are performing a necessary act of historical correction. We are borrowing strength from a source they despise, and when the son is born, he will be strong enough to inherit everything they are too weak to hold." This horrifying rationalization was meant to soothe their guilt, but only deepened the psychological chasm opening beneath them. Beatrice, the most emotionally fragile, absorbed the terror like water. She began to wander the grounds at night, whispering to the house slaves, a desperate need for connection and confession overpowering her fear. She didn't speak of the breeding, but of the coldness in the house, the secrets in the walls, the sounds she heard from the rear wing. The old house slaves, wary and wise, recognized the signs of a mind breaking under intolerable stress. They began to weave Beatrice's fragmented whispers into their own silent network of information, turning her madness into a fragile, dangerous form of intelligence that was slowly, inevitably, finding its way beyond the walls of Oak Grove. The Black Ledger was now becoming a detailed catalog of hybrid genetics. Eleanor's plan was moving past mere survival. It was entering a phase of perfection. The successful harvesting of traits from Elias Jeb and 2 subsequent men had confirmed her hypothesis. She could, through sequential selection, engineer the exact combination of strength, intelligence, and physical markers she desired. The evidence, recorded in her arcane cipher, was horrifying in its precision. She wasn't just knotting the men she used. She was knotting the families she was targeting. She had found a man whose distinctive high cheekbones were identical to those of the powerful McQueen family, the current state senator. Another man carried the long, delicate fingers that marked the Pembroke banking dynasty. These men were all living, breathing proof of the widespread, generational miscegenation that the white gentry fiercely denied. Eleanor's genetic database was not just a tool for creating an heir. It was an arsenal of blackmail. As the dark archive grew, Eleanor was completely consumed, spending hours reviewing the entries, calculating the optimal moment for her daughters to conceive. She realized her time was running short. Her daughters were aging, and the rising political tension in the country hinted at a war that could unravel the entire social structure and invalidate her plan. But her obsessive focus on the ledger nearly caused her downfall. While she was deep in calculation, a distant cousin, a man named Marcus Alcott, arrived unannounced from Savannah, stating he had concerns about the estate's finances and had come, ostensibly, to ensure the poor widow was not being taken advantage of. Marcus Alcott was a tedious man, more concerned with social appearances than financial details, but his sudden arrival sent a cold dart of panic through Eleanor. A distant relation, he represented the exact kind of prying, judgmental scrutiny that could collapse her entire operation. He was ostensibly concerned about the Alcott name, worried that a woman running a plantation alone would bring shame to the lineage. Eleanor, however, was a masterful actress. She received him with a performance of weary, virtuous widowhood, her dresses modest, her manner deferential. She presented the official, flawlessly maintained ledger, showing him respectable profits and modest expenses. She positioned her daughters, Clara knitting demurely, Lydia serving tea, as perfect symbols of purity and domestic stability, using their apparent innocence as a shield. "I am merely trying to hold on to my late husband's legacy, cousin," she sighed, portraying herself as a woman overwhelmed but dedicated to tradition. Marcus was quickly appeased. He found no evidence of financial misdeeds and was satisfied that the daughters were growing into proper Southern ladies. But just as he was preparing to leave, having consumed too much sherry, he paused on the veranda. He pointed to a small, older slave woman working in the vegetable patch. "Remarkable," he mumbled, wiping his mouth. "Does she remind you of anyone, Eleanor? She has the Pembroke profile, doesn't she? That high, arrogant nose. I recall a rumor from years ago." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of polite confusion. "I only see a servant, Marcus. Your Savannah heat must be getting to you." She quickly ushered him to his carriage. The encounter was a stark reminder. The evidence of genetic mingling was everywhere, hidden in plain sight, and all it would take was one suspicious, observant eye to unravel the careful tapestry of her deception. While Clara fought her mother with silent resistance, and Beatrice dissolved into fearful madness, Lydia, the youngest, chose the path of terrifying compliance. Too young and terrified to conceive of rebellion, she internalized Eleanor's doctrine. To survive, she had to stop seeing the men as people and start viewing them as resources, genetic components necessary for the maintenance of the only life she had ever known. Lydia became Eleanor's most useful and obedient assistant. She was the one who kept the quiet room clean, wiping away the remnants of the ceremonies with a blank, emotionless efficiency. She was the one who, with cold, steady hands, would collect the hair and skin samples Eleanor required for her archive. Her fear had calcified into a sterile, horrifying pragmatism. She had, in effect, become a younger, more easily controlled version of her mother. This compliance made her privy to information the other daughters were intentionally shielded from. One evening, she overheard Eleanor and the overseer, Silas, discussing a major land sale scheduled for the following year. This sale required not just proof of clear title, but proof of a secure, future lineage, a guaranteed male heir who would ensure the Alcott name's continuity for generations. The sale was the ultimate goal, the final validation of Eleanor's life's work. It meant her plan had to move from the documentation phase to the conception phase immediately. Lydia listened to the chilling details and realized that her mother's time for waiting was over, and the time for her own personal, permanent sacrifice was about to begin. The day after the discussion with Silas, Eleanor summoned her 3 daughters to the study, the black ledger open on the mahogany desk. There was no pretense, no soft words. The veil of documenting and preparing was ripped away. "The time for theory is past," she announced, her voice resonating with cold authority. "The system requires proof of an heir. The men have been studied, the genetics perfected. Now it is your turn to conceive." The demand hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The daughters were no longer assistants. They were the final, necessary vessels. The horror they had only witnessed was now to become their personal, permanent reality. Eleanor revealed that she had selected 3 specific men, one for each daughter, chosen for the precise genetic combination each woman needed to carry the ideal Alcott son. For Clara, the eldest, Eleanor revealed her ultimate choice, Cyrus. Cyrus was a man she had recently purchased at an unparalleled price, a man renowned not just for his powerful physique, but for his deep, quiet intellect and his startlingly intense gray-green eyes, a feature traced back to a specific, almost mythical Alcott ancestor. Eleanor believed Cyrus held the key to the family's future dominance, a fusion of strength and cunning that would be invincible in the coming war. She presented Cyrus's archived records to Clara with a terrifying pride, as if showing off a perfectly engineered weapon. Clara stared at the documentation, then lifted her eyes to the door, where Cyrus himself, tall, silent, and acutely aware of the nightmare he was part of, stood waiting, not as a brutal captor but as her equal, silent victim. Clara looked at Cyrus, then at her mother, and finally understood the full, devastating scope of the plan. Her mind raced, connecting the vanishing men, the coded ledger, and the death of her father. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The vanished men hadn't just been disposed of. They had been executed to prevent any future claim to the bloodline that she was now being forced to carry. Every man used in Eleanor's genetic preparation was eliminated so that only the designated heir, her child, would possess the sole, unchallengeable genetic claim. The silence that surrounded them was not just social convention, it was the prison itself. The law would never protect them. In fact, the law sanctioned the complete ownership and disposal of the men being used. There was nowhere to run, no one to confess to, because her mother had created a crime so unique, so rooted in the era's dark logic, that no court would believe her. Clara was trapped in a web woven from race, law, and familial obsession. But looking again at Cyrus, she saw not a rapist, but a man who shared her entrapment, a man who possessed the intelligence to grasp the terrifying dynamics of their situation. He met her gaze, his gray-green eyes conveying a profound, shared horror. He was the most dangerous man on the plantation, yet he was also her only potential ally. As Eleanor launched into a final, clinical explanation of how the conception would proceed, Cyrus shifted his weight slightly, and with a movement only Clara could detect, he subtly moved his hand, a gesture that, in the terrifying silence of the room, indicated a quiet, impossible form of resistance, a plan that would require both her body and his intellect to execute, a path to rebellion that would start from within the confines of her mother's terrifying design. Cyrus was not like the others. Where Elias had been resigned and Jeb compliant, Cyrus possessed an unusual detachment, a cold, calculating patience that matched Eleanor's own. He had observed the dynamics of Oak Grove, the fear of the daughters, the unnerving movements of the overseer, and the chilling finality of the vanished men. He didn't need to break Eleanor's code to understand its purpose. He knew he was chosen not for his labor, but for the lineage she hoped to steal. When Eleanor left them alone in the parlor that evening, a terrifying silence fell. Clara, shaking, expected violence or despair. Instead, Cyrus spoke, his voice low, measured, and startlingly articulate, marked by an education Eleanor hadn't anticipated. She seeks strength for her name, Mistress Clara. She believes she can control the seed as she controls the crop. He spoke of Eleanor's plan not with rage, but as an intellectual problem they shared. He quickly saw the paradox. To achieve her goal, Eleanor needed a son with his intelligence, which meant she had to keep him alive, at least until the pregnancy was confirmed. This gave them a fleeting, fragile window. "She documents everything," Clara whispered, gripping the chair. "The traits, the timings, the results. The success of her plan depends on perfection." Cyrus smiled grimly, a flash of shared cynicism. "Then perfection is what we must deny her." His eyes fixed on the documentation on the desk, the meticulous records of the genetic material Eleanor had compiled. He proposed a dangerous, quiet form of resistance, a sabotage built around Eleanor's obsession with accurate data. He suggested a way to ensure the child born would not carry the perfect genetic markers, but a mixture designed to confuse and ultimately invalidate her entire blueprint. He asked Clara if she had the courage to defy her mother's system with her own body, and to risk carrying a child who would be the ultimate proof of her failure. Eleanor's operation was known only to herself and her terrified daughters, but there was one other man, Silas, the overseer. Silas was a brute, a man of limited intellect but absolute loyalty, driven by a perverse combination of fear and the promise of a hidden percentage of the plantation's true profits, the money Eleanor funneled off the books from her inflated slave sales. Silas managed the physical dangers of the operation, the quiet room's construction, the disposal of the evidence, and the maintenance of the security around the main house. Silas didn't understand the genetic calculus, but he understood power and risk. He was the silent, menacing enforcer, a white man who was nonetheless a prisoner of Eleanor's terrible secret. He was tasked with monitoring the daughters, especially Clara, whom Eleanor sensed was the most likely to break. Silas spent his days watching the main house, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. One evening, while patrolling the edge of the property, Silas discovered a small, tightly folded piece of paper caught in the root of an old oak tree near the road. It was a note, crudely written but addressed in a desperate hand to the town lawyer, pleading for an anonymous meeting regarding proof of my father's murder. It was not signed, but Silas instantly recognized the familiar, elegant script of Clara Alcott. The note mentioned a hidden letter and a pattern of disappearances. Silas had stumbled upon not just a note but a fuse. He immediately burned the paper, wiping the ashes from his hands. He knew this level of public exposure would mean the gallows for Eleanor and a lifetime of labor for him. He marched directly to Eleanor's study, his face pale with fear, and revealed the sabotage attempt. Eleanor listened, her features hardening into a mask of pure, murderous intent. She understood that Clara was no longer just a vessel. She was a traitor who needed to be controlled, perhaps permanently silenced, before the conception was allowed to proceed. Eleanor's cold fury over Clara's betrayal was contained, but absolute. She didn't punish Clara physically. She punished her with increased control. The dates, the times, and the circumstances of the conception attempts were now dictated with clinical, military precision, eliminating any opportunity for Cyrus or Clara to communicate or resist. But Cyrus's intellect was already at work. He had predicted her response and built his counterplan around her obsession with genetic purity. Eleanor's plan required the perfect blend of traits from a specific line of the Alcott ancestry. Cyrus knew the exact time windows Eleanor was using for her calculations. He used the brief moments of freedom, his supervised field labor, to administer subtle, natural agents he had learned about from the old hands, agents that would confuse the delicate timing and viability of the desired outcome. He was deliberately injecting genetic variants into the process, hoping to ensure that the resultant child, if born, would be an aberration from Eleanor's blueprint. Clara, despite the terror, held up her end of the bargain. She performed the role of the submissive, pregnant daughter, all the while praying that Cyrus's subtle sabotage had succeeded. The plan was a gamble. If they succeeded, Eleanor would get a son, but not the perfect son. If they failed and the child was born exactly as Eleanor intended, Cyrus would pay the ultimate price. But the moment of reckoning came sooner than expected. Eleanor, reviewing a batch of samples she had secretly taken, noticed an inconsistency in the readings, a disruption in the established pattern of genetic material, and her cold realization of the sabotage unleashed a terrifying primal fury. "He has corrupted the line," she screamed, ordering Silas to prepare Cyrus not for sale, but for a brutal, painful lesson far worse than death. The house descended into a frozen state of panic. Cyrus was immediately locked away, and Eleanor's focus became entirely fixed on Clara. The potential confirmation of pregnancy was now an agonizing, terrifying waiting game. If the child was conceived and proved to be the imperfect heir, Eleanor's vengeance would be unimaginable. The waiting finally ended, and the doctor's confirmation, Clara was pregnant, brought no joy, only a profound physical dread. Eleanor immediately initiated the public facade. Clara was now declared sick, confined to her rooms, and protected from all callers under the pretense of a severe constitutional fragility. Rumors of a secret engagement to a distant, wealthy cousin were quietly circulated, a believable story used to explain the pregnancy and to provide the child with a publicly acceptable father. But internally, the pressure was immense. Clara's body was now the battleground for the war between mother and daughter, between scientific evil and desperate resistance. She didn't know if Cyrus's sabotage had worked. All she knew was the weight of the growing life inside her, a life conceived in terror but holding the potential for a dark, defiant freedom. Meanwhile, Beatrice, driven to the brink by the terror and the guilt of her own forced conception attempt with another of Eleanor's chosen men, began her final, irreversible mental decline. She stopped speaking, but started moving, drawn toward the only place she felt a connection to the world before Oak Grove's horrors: the river. Just as the public facade was being built around Clara's secret marriage, the outside world came crashing back in. Marcus Alcott, the inquisitive cousin, returned, but this time he was not alone. He was accompanied by Sheriff Thornton, a stern, heavily mustachioed man of local repute. Marcus was not pursuing financial concerns this time. A few weeks prior, while hunting near the county border, he had stumbled upon something deeply unsettling: a set of high-quality gentleman's leather boots hidden beneath a pile of brush. The boots bore a distinctive cobbler's mark from Charleston, and they were the exact size of a man who had vanished from Oak Grove 2 years earlier. Marcus, spurred by his previous vague suspicions and the knowledge that the vanished man, Isaac, had been sold just before his disappearance, raised the alarm. The sheriff, initially skeptical of Eleanor's involvement, couldn't ignore the discovery. A slave running away would not abandon such expensive, distinctive footwear. The discovery raised a chilling implication. Isaac hadn't run away. He had been eliminated. Eleanor received the two men in the parlor, displaying her usual composure, but inwardly she was in a panic. The graves were her greatest vulnerability. She maintained her cool exterior, insisting the boots were simply discarded by a successful runaway, an intentional misdirection. The sheriff, hesitant to accuse a prominent widow, accepted her explanation for now. But the air had shifted. The boots were physical proof that the paper trail was a lie. As the sheriff left, satisfied but still slightly uneasy, the sight of a heavily pregnant Clara being escorted up the stairs by Lydia, a woman with no husband, carrying a child whose father was a carefully constructed lie, registered in the sheriff's mind, a fresh piece of unease he would carry back to town. The sheriff's visit shattered the oppressive calm of Oak Grove. Eleanor, shaken but resolute, understood that the time for careful, patient planning was over. The law, slow and biased, but inexorable, was finally circling her secret. She was forced to open her plantation to a rudimentary official inquiry. The inquiry was a farce. The sheriff interviewed Silas, who lied flawlessly. He spoke briefly to the field hands, whose terrified, cryptic answers he quickly dismissed as superstition. He found nothing of note, but the investigation, however flawed, created a moment of chaos and distraction in the rigid routine of the plantation. It was during this breach in security that the house slaves, led by an elderly laundress named Mamie, made their move. Mamie had been watching Eleanor for decades. She had seen the men arrive and the men vanish. She had listened to Beatrice's fractured whispers. She couldn't speak the full truth, but she could leak subtlety. She placed a discarded, small bone, deliberately charred, in the fire pit outside the kitchen. She quietly directed the attention of a curious, young deputy to the unusually hard, rocky soil in the unused vineyard patch, mentioning offhand that Eleanor insisted on keeping that ground fallow. They were dropping breadcrumbs of fact into the sheriff's path, hoping that even the most blindly prejudiced lawman would eventually be forced to see the truth. But the real danger remained Eleanor's black leather ledger, the ultimate coded weapon, which she was now racing against time to move from its hidden cache beneath the floorboards to a location even Silas didn't know. With the sheriff's presence still a recent memory and the house slaves subtly planting seeds of doubt, Eleanor knew the black ledger was a ticking bomb. She couldn't keep it beneath the floorboards of her bedroom any longer. She needed a location that was physically inaccessible to everyone but herself. Her choice was as ingenious as it was desperate. Deep within the stone foundation of the main house was a defunct, hand-dug cistern, now dry and sealed with a heavy flagstone. Eleanor spent a frantic afternoon directing Silas to remove the stone, not with the full gang, but with a single mule and a winch, creating minimum disturbance. She climbed down into the damp, lightless cavity herself, wrapping the leather ledger in oiled canvas and burying it deep in the muddy clay at the cistern's base. She covered the spot, replaced the flagstone, and then had Sela's seal it with a fresh layer of mortar. It was a secure tomb for her secrets. However, the concealment was merely a temporary solution. She needed a decisive, immediate distraction to turn the sheriff's attention away from the house and the vulnerable, unused land. That night, under Eleanor's cold, calculated instruction, Silas crept to the main barn, where he had already doused a corner with lamp oil. His orders were to set a spectacular fire, one that would consume the structure but stop short of reaching the house. The goal was to destroy records, draw the county fire brigade, and create a narrative of accidental calamity. But Silas, fueled by fear of his own eventual disposal and Eleanor's terrifying coldness, grew careless. The flames he ignited were too intense, too quick, and as the roar of the fire ripped through the night, Silas realized he hadn't just created a distraction. He had created a chaotic, uncontrolled spectacle that would ultimately bring more attention, not less, to the dark secrets of Oak Grove. The fire, raging violently less than 100 yards from the main house, provided the backdrop for the moment Eleanor had meticulously engineered her life toward. The physical shock and the blinding light of the blaze seemed to accelerate Clara's labor, which began with terrifying swiftness. The doctor couldn't be summoned. The roads were choked with onlookers and the meager fire crew. Only Beatrice and Lydia, terrified but trained by their mother in the cold rituals of the house, were present to assist. Clara's pain was amplified by the psychological horror of the scene, the rhythmic screaming of the fire, the stench of burning wood, and the chilling realization that her son was being born into utter catastrophe. She labored through the long hours, holding the image of Cyrus in her mind, the man whose defiance she hoped was carried in the child's very cells. As the flames finally began to die down in the distance, a new sound filled the house, the sharp, defiant cry of a newborn son. He was healthy, strong, and possessed the startling, intense gray-green eyes that Eleanor had so coveted, the mark of the Alcott ancestor, the proof of Cyrus's desirable genetics. But his features also carried a hint of the genetic sabotage, a slight variation in the chin structure that was a silent victory for Cyrus and Clara. Eleanor pushed her daughters aside, her eyes fixed only on the infant. She didn't cradle him. She examined him, her fingers tracing the tiny contours of his face as if reading a geological map. Finally, a terrifying smile stretched across her face, a look of profound, cold triumph. "The family name is secure," she declared, her voice rough with satisfaction, completely ignoring the mother, the trauma, and the burning ruin outside. The fire was officially ruled an accident, likely caused by spontaneous combustion of damp hay, a believable narrative that Eleanor subtly encouraged. The sheriff returned the following morning to finalize the report, his primary concern now the cost of the damage and the loss of local property. He was a man of the system, trained to see what fit the established narrative. Accidents happen, slaves run away, and prominent white widows are incapable of premeditated crime. He briefly noted the birth of Clara's son, offering a cursory congratulations to Eleanor on the continuation of the line, never questioning the timeline or the missing father. When the house slaves, following Mamie's instructions, tried to whisper about the unusual dirt near the vineyard patch, the sheriff dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "Superstition, Mrs. Alcott. They see ghosts where there are only rocks." His prejudice, his ingrained, deep-seated belief in the racial and gender hierarchy, was Eleanor's greatest shield. He simply could not conceive of a Southern lady orchestrating a systematic campaign of genetic manipulation and murder. He signed the final report, effectively closing the investigation into both the fire and the missing man, Isaac. He had the opportunity to look deeper, to question the oddities of the Alcott plantation, but he chose the path of least resistance, the path that confirmed his own worldview. But as he was walking out, Mamie stood silently by the door, and with an imperceptible shift of her eyes, directed his attention not to the outside, but to a faint, perfectly circular seam in the floor of the utility corridor, the newly mortared edge of the flagstone that covered the old cistern, a silent, damning clue the sheriff, blinded by his own assumptions, failed to notice. While Eleanor was celebrating the security of her dynasty, a quiet counterstrike was launched from over 1,000 miles away. A month after the birth, a small, unassuming packet arrived at the Oak Grove post office addressed to Mrs. Clara Alcott. It contained a copy of her late father's last will and testament, forwarded by his distant, estranged, abolitionist-leaning cousin in Philadelphia, the same attorney Thomas had attempted to contact before his death. The will revealed a devastating complication to Eleanor's plan. Thomas Alcott, anticipating his wife's obsessive nature, had shrewdly structured the inheritance. Eleanor was granted full managerial control, but the land and the official Alcott name were not to pass to her or her daughters directly. Instead, they were held in a trust, contingent upon the birth of a male heir of Thomas Alcott's blood. If no such heir could be proven, the estate was to be sold, and the proceeds given to a distant orphanage trust. This document was Clara's key to freedom. It meant her son, the boy conceived with Cyrus, was not the legal heir by Thomas's definition. The name was still destined for extinction, unless Eleanor could prove she had not violated the trust. But the greater power of the letter lay in the benefactor mentioned, a highly powerful, wealthy shipping magnate in Boston who shared Thomas's anti-slavery sentiments. This man was prepared to take legal action to enforce the will's terms, if only he had proof of Eleanor's crimes. Clara held the paper, proof that her mother's entire, monstrous scheme was built on a legal technicality that rendered the perfect heir completely invalid, a secret weapon that could destroy her mother's dominion, but only if she dared to use it. Beatrice, unable to endure the silent complicity, the forced witnessing of her nephew's birth, and the constant threat of her mother's control, finally broke. Her mind, already frail, completely fractured after she was forced to clean the blood-soaked linens from Clara's birthing room. She saw the new heir as a demon, a tangible manifestation of her mother's evil. One stormy night, she slipped out of the main house. She didn't run away, she walked directly to the sheriff's office in town. She couldn't form coherent sentences about genetic selection or coded ledgers. Her confession was the language of her breakdown, fragmented, hysterical, but intensely focused on one specific, devastating detail. She kept repeating the same phrase, "The earth is too full. Mother keeps burying her failures in the orchard." Her words were dismissed by the deputy on duty as the ravings of a hysterical woman, but the specific mention of the orchard, the exact, small patch of unused, rocky ground that Mamie had previously highlighted, struck a chord. The deputy, a younger man with less ingrained prejudice than the sheriff, wrote down the precise location. He couldn't ignore the confluence of the house slave's hint, the missing boots, and the daughter's frantic, specific confession. He knew his sheriff had closed the case, but the image of the disturbed earth lingered in his mind. He quietly returned to Oak Grove the following morning alone, without telling the sheriff, carrying a shovel and the chilling coordinates Beatrice had whispered. Behind the third cedar tree, where the ground is always soft. The young deputy dug for hours, hidden by the oppressive heat and the remote location. He found nothing but rocks and clay, and he was about to give up, convinced he was chasing a madwoman's ghost. But then his shovel hit something that wasn't rock. It was soft, yielding, and unmistakably man-made. He widened the hole, and within minutes, the sickening reality of Oak Grove erupted into the light. He uncovered the first body, a skeleton remarkably preserved by the clay soil, its clothes tattered but identifiable. A faint, crescent-shaped impression was still visible behind the left ear, a birthmark. This was Elias, the first man, the foundation of Eleanor's plan, his body serving as the ultimate chilling archive. The deputy frantically dug the adjacent plots, unearthing one grave after another. This was no single crime of passion. It was a mass grave, a systematic field of disposal. The deputy abandoned his shovel and ran back to town, his mind reeling with the impossible, horrifying scale of the crime. The sheriff, confronted with the deputy's frantic report and the visual evidence, was finally forced to acknowledge the unthinkable. Eleanor Alcott was not a grieving widow but a serial murderer. The authorities descended upon Oak Grove, not just for a search, but for an exhumation. As the bodies were carefully uncovered and catalogued, the county doctor, called in to examine the remains, made a chilling discovery. On the bones of Elias and several others, he noted certain specific anatomical features that exactly matched the cryptic, non-financial entries in Eleanor's public official plantation ledger, proof that her record-keeping was a horrifying cipher designed to track her victims. The exhumation of the Oak Grove orchard was a scene of horrifying, methodical chaos. 13 bodies were eventually recovered, each one confirming the meticulous, systematic nature of the crime. The county doctor, working under the scrutiny of Sheriff Thornton, began to piece together the anatomical evidence. He realized that the unusual features he was finding on the remains, specific bone structures, rare dental formations, and most damningly, the persistent, distinctive birthmarks, were too consistent to be coincidence. The sheriff, now faced with the undeniable scale of the murders, finally understood the significance of Eleanor's paper trail. The sales records were a calculated lie. The men hadn't run away. They were selectively executed after their use to eliminate genetic rivals. But the doctor's findings pointed to an even deeper horror. He cross-referenced the unique anatomical notes he took on the bodies with the cryptic, non-financial markings Eleanor had made in her official ledger, the notations that the sheriff had previously dismissed as harmless. The details matched. This was the terrifying revelation. Eleanor wasn't just compiling a private list. She was using her public records as a decoy, a cipher hidden in plain sight. The sheriff realized that the black leather ledger, the one Eleanor had kept hidden for years, was not just an accounting book, but a meticulously constructed biological weapon. It was a key to a devastating truth about every prominent white family in the region. Eleanor Alcott was immediately arrested, displaying a terrifying calm that unnerved the local authorities more than any hysterical outburst would have. She denied nothing, simply stating, "I acted for the preservation of my line." The black ledger was eventually found, thanks to Mamie and the deputy who followed her vague hint, locating the newly cemented flagstone leading to the cistern. The book was damp, but the coded ink remained legible. The immediate problem was the cipher. The local officials, faced with pages of symbols that resembled archaic naval charts, were stumped. They could prove murder, but they couldn't prove the full, horrifying intent, the names and families Eleanor had exposed. That's when Clara, holding her healthy, gray-eyed son, made her final, terrifying move. She approached the sheriff, Thomas's letter to the Philadelphia lawyer in her hand. Clara revealed that her father, an amateur cartographer, had once used her grandfather's old Savannah shipping manifests as a cipher template for family games. She offered to break the code, but the offer came with an absolute demand: immunity for herself and her sisters, and immediate legal manumission for her son and for Cyrus, who was still locked in the barn cellar. She would give them the truth, but only in exchange for a future free from her mother's dominion and the system that enabled it. Sheriff Thornton, faced with a mass murder case that was already threatening to expose half the county's elite, reluctantly agreed to her terms, knowing he was trading one terrible crime for a systemic, necessary silence. Clara sat in the sheriff's office, translating the code entry by entry, her voice steady but hollow. The pages were a chilling genealogy of shame. Dagger mark, high brow, iron will. The cryptic symbols unlocked into real names. Elia's ancestry traced to Senator McQueen, Jeb's to the Pembroke banking dynasty, and Cyrus's to a direct, forbidden lineage of Thomas Alcott's own grandfather. Eleanor hadn't just used slaves. She had used the forbidden, unacknowledged sons of the very men who upheld the system of racial purity. The ledger proved that for years, prominent white families had sired children with enslaved women, then sold them south to eliminate the evidence, only for those children or their descendants to be deliberately purchased by Eleanor Alcott to serve as genetic donors for her own line. It was a perfect, horrifying cycle of hypocrisy and revenge. When Eleanor, brought in for official questioning, was confronted with the decoded ledger, she showed no remorse. She didn't deny the murders, she didn't deny the breeding. Instead, she looked at the list of names: McQueen, Pembroke, Caldwell, the men who had profited and preached morality, and her face softened with a terrifying, serene pride. "I gave the Alcott name the strength it needed," she stated, her voice resonating with cold conviction. "And I exposed the lie at the heart of this society. They built their world on this same filth, only they hid it. I merely documented it." She was taken away, convicted within weeks of multiple counts of murder, but not before she sent a final, chilling message to Clara, delivered by a nervous guard. "He has the gray eyes, Clara. He will take what is ours. Remember your duty." The public fallout was devastating. The sheriff, desperate to contain the scandal, could not suppress the full truth revealed in the ledger. While the names of the most prominent families were legally redacted from the trial transcripts, the whispers of the documented ancestry spread like wildfire through the county. Fortunes were questioned, reputations crumbled, the social fabric of the gentry was momentarily, violently fractured. Eleanor Alcott, the plantation lady, became a terrifying symbol of the secret sins of the Antebellum South. Oak Grove was seized by the state and put up for immediate auction. Clara, Beatrice, and Lydia, protected by the terms of their deal, were ostracized but legally safe. Cyrus and the infant son, legally freed, were now under the protection of the northern philanthropist. The Alcott name was, officially, dead in the county. As the family carriage pulled away from the property for the last time, Clara looked back at the house, now a shell of its former self, and at the freshly turned earth of the orchard. She had won freedom for her son and herself, but at the cost of unimaginable trauma. Clara reached into the small traveling bag beside her and pulled out a single, folded page of parchment. A copy of the final, single, coded entry she had made sure to keep from the ledger. A cryptic family history of the son who now carried the strongest, most dangerous bloodline in the state. Eleanor Alcott died in a Georgia prison less than a year after her conviction, reportedly of a quiet, stubborn refusal to eat. The Alcott daughters scattered. Beatrice, though free, never recovered her sanity and was eventually placed in the care of a distant, kinder relative in the north. Lydia, desperate to shed the horror, married a respectable merchant in Atlanta and never spoke of Oak Grove again, attempting to bury the dark knowledge deep within her memory. Clara, however, chose a different path. She traveled north with Cyrus and her son, whom she named Thomas after her father. Cyrus, now a free man, used his remarkable intellect to secure a position working with the abolitionist newspaper that had initially contacted Eleanor years before. He never publicly claimed paternity, allowing Thomas to be known only as Clara's son, born of her brief, fictitious, secret marriage. It was a delicate, protective lie in a world still bound by race. Their struggle was not over. The legal freedom was a fragile thing. Clara's life became a quiet, constant battle to ensure her son inherited the intellectual strength of his forbidden lineage, while protecting him from its physical identification. She had traded the tyranny of her mother for a lifetime of watchful caution. But the ultimate legacy was the son himself, growing up in a world of northern abolitionists, hearing the whispers of his true, unique paternity, a boy who represented the ultimate, dark success of Eleanor's twisted science. Decades passed. The Civil War came, fractured the South, and brought official freedom to millions, but it never erased the ingrained power of bloodlines and names. Thomas Alcott, the boy born of the quiet room, grew into a man of striking intelligence and presence. He bore the Alcott name, but his gray-green eyes and powerful build were a silent testament to the genetic contributions of Cyrus and the strength Eleanor had coveted. He understood from a young age the secret of his birth, the systematic murder, the desperate sabotage, and the dynastic obsession that created him. He was the living proof of the South's hidden hypocrisy, a man who, by the standards of the former society, was both an Alcott heir and a forbidden child. His inheritance was not land, but a profound knowledge of the interconnectedness of race and power in America. Thomas ultimately chose to use his lineage not for revenge, but for reform. He became a writer, using his unique perspective to pen scathing, anonymous articles that exposed the systemic racism and quiet injustices of the Reconstruction era, often specifically targeting the continued power of the families his grandmother had documented in the ledger. The Alcott name, once a symbol of Southern aristocratic purity, became a chilling, silent threat, wielded by the very bloodline it was meant to exclude. He was the perfect heir, not to Eleanor's land, but to her terrifying, ruthless determination to expose the lie, a determination that had been tragically purified by his mother's desperation and his father's intellect. The story of Eleanor Alcott and Oak Grove Plantation ends not with a neat conclusion, but with a lasting, unsettling question. Her trial, her conviction, and the destruction of her dynasty failed to answer the essential moral paradox at the heart of her monstrous crime. She was, unquestionably, a systematic killer and a tyrant who used her own daughters and enslaved men as genetic instruments. Yet in her warped quest for dynastic preservation, she became the only person who dared to fully document and expose the deep, pervasive genetic hypocrisy of the Southern aristocracy. She used the worst aspect of the system, the legal ownership of human beings, to commit the ultimate treason against its most cherished value, white racial purity. She committed murder to secure a son, but that son, Thomas Alcott, grew up to use his forbidden lineage to fight the very institutions his grandmother sought to preserve. So we are left with the chilling final judgment. Was Eleanor Alcott a monstrous murderer obsessed with bloodlines, or a dark avenging angel who used the system's own secrets to destroy it from within? A woman who was both the ultimate villain and the ultimate, twisted witness to the darkest truth of the antebellum South. Share your theories in the comments below. How should history remember the plantation lady who had no sons? And what do you think became of that single, final coded entry Clara took with her? Make sure you subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America for more forbidden knowledge and chilling secrets from the past.